Well, the storms and the strikes. I mean, one of the things we went into this report knowing, because the Bureau of Labor Statistics told us, was that the strike was going to subtract more than 40,000 workers. And we saw more than that in the manufacturing of transportation equipment. That was down about 44K. Now we know that there's upstream workers. I think some of the decline in temp workers, upstream workers in manufacturing from probably Boeing supply chains, I would probably assign another 10K negative on that. And then you get over to the hurricanes. That's much more uncertain, much harder to estimate. But the Bureau itself, which they don't often do, the Bureau itself said that the hurricanes very likely played a role here. So the way you set it up is exactly right. The underlying strength of the American economy, the American labor force is ongoing. We have a full spate of reports from this week that show that to be the case. And if you look at the unemployment rate, which is far less affected by strikes and hurricanes, that held at 4.1%, an historically low rate. So you have to block out the noise, try to find the signal, and if you do so, you see the U.S. economy continues to move ahead with momentum.
The response rate to the establishment survey, Jared, was just 47.4%. The lowest since January of 1991, well below last month's 62%. What do you make of that number?
There were 460,000 people, according to the Bureau this morning, that couldn't get to work because of the weather. Not every one of those persons got taken off payrolls. If they were paid over the relevant period, they'd be counted. But obviously, many of them were taken off payrolls, as were strikers. Strikers don't get counted on payrolls, but the strikers do get counted as being employed in the other survey, in the household survey. And that's why, if you want to think of it simply, take some signal. Look, you never want to over-torque on one month, and this month especially, you want to be mindful of the noise. But take some signal from the unemployment rate, which held steady at 4.1, and you got to write off the payroll number as largely noise due to strikes and hurricanes.
4.1, I believe, is the lowest pre-election unemployment rate in 24 years, Jared. You can correct me if I'm wrong on that. And I guess I would ask you, big picture then, for the sake of our viewers and listeners today, how would you describe the market if it weren't for these aberrations? How would you describe the job market days before this election?
Growing at a solid pace, generating enough jobs to hold the unemployment rate where it is, so hitting what economists call the break-even level, meaning enough employment to absorb people coming into the labor force, give people good job opportunities to upgrade. Even though vacancies have come down, we still have significant openings. And I think the main thing from the perspective of American working households is that this jobs report, including in October, is generating real wage gains. Wages were up 4% year over year. Now, we don't have the CPI yet for October, but for September it was 2.4%, and expectations are that it's somewhere in that ballpark, which means yet another growth, yet another month of real wage growth. Earlier this week in the consumer spending report, we learned that disposable income, real after-tax income, also up, and in fact, since this president took office, up $4,000. Real buying power up for working households. Now, our work is not done. Joe, we've talked about this a lot. We have to continue our cost-cutting agenda in housing, in childcare, in healthcare, in prescription drugs, and we have to defend that agenda against those who would repeal it, pushing prices in exactly the wrong direction.
We heard from the Donald Trump campaign a response to the job market this morning. Jared, it does not make mention of hurricanes, but it says in a single month, Kamala's failed economic agenda wiped out nearly 30,000 private sector jobs, nearly 50,000 manufacturing jobs. Working families, it goes on to say, are being ripped off by the Harris-Biden economic agenda. Kamala broke the economy. You can respond to that as you will, but I wonder if the Harris-Biden economic agenda includes the weather.
I don't do electoral politics. I need to stay out of that. I will say the following. If you're commenting on or analyzing or putting forth an interpretation of today's payroll number that ignores hurricanes and ignores strikes, you are not engaged in good faith analysis. You are engaged in political manipulation, and you should be summarily ignored.
That said, No hurricanes, and potentially, as we're reading today, progress in the Boeing strike, Jared, would make next jobs report look like what?
Yeah, it's a great point. So we know we have an agreement between the machinists and the machinists, I should say the union leadership and the management for a vote on Monday. It is, of course, up to the rank and file to decide whether they approve that new contract, but that is a good news of progress in that area. One of the things we showed today, you guys would love this, so you should go check it out on my Twitter feed, which is EconJared46, is if you look at the movement in unemployment claims, this is responsive to your question about what to expect next month. The unemployment claims really spiked, as they should, in the areas that were affected by hurricanes, devastated by hurricanes. As those areas rebuild and get back on track, and there's still a long way to go. They were devastated, and we're going to help them every step of the way. You see claims coming back down. That spike has really done a pretty significant round trip. And by the way, we contrast that to areas where there was no hurricane, and there you see claims were pretty flat. So if you look at claims response to the hurricane, they went up, they came down, and when they went up was the reference period for the payroll survey. It explains the noise in the payroll survey today. But yes, it looks like we should be getting back on track for next month's report.
Okay, I'm not allowed to ask you about the Fed because I know you're going to talk to me about Fed independence, Mr. Chairman. I guess I'd ask you, with the data we've seen here, it was a big data week leading into this election, and this Fed meeting just happens to be one next week. You probably didn't hear about it, but I wonder if the data change your view when it comes to the trajectory of interest rates, if only in the bond market.
Well, we've seen rates in the bond market be somewhat elevated. We've certainly seen the mortgage rate go up, and part of that has to do with the stronger economy. So look, under President Biden, we got the GDP report this week. Under President Biden, the annualized growth rate for GDP has been slightly north of 3%. That is a very strong, very much above trend growth rate. So strong growth, solid labor market, easing prices, real wage and income gains, certainly putting some upward pressure there. But I also think there's a policy element going on in that spread, in that interest rate. And I think it has to do with the idea that one of the candidates is talking about massive tariffs acting as a sales tax on the middle class, massive deportations, terrible idea for the labor market, and compromising Fed independence. That may also be putting some upward pressure on rates. And I think that's just a sign of some of those destructive ideas.